Last time it was at the University of Gallen, and now we are online. And it's our pleasure to have you here. Thanks a lot for the flexibility for your time. It will be 1 hour session, the maximum, and let's start with questions with the topic, and later on we will see if we have enough time for the further question and answers. Uh, Please welcome
Okay.
and
Thank you, Samir. Maybe I'll just quickly give some background on myself so you can get some context of what I'm going to describe here. I'm a pragmatic engineer and cybersecurity specialist, right? As Samir mentioned, I was with Procter& and Gamble for 36 and a half years, and the last 8 years of that was leading a cybersecurity transformation across the company. And I can tell you, it took us about 5 to 6 years to complete that transformation. We were benchmarking with various other companies. So I'm hoping today, as Samir sort of gives me some questions to answer here, I can give you that in the context of not only what the Procter& and Gamble company did, but also other companies that we networked with and we benchmarked with in terms of how we established a mature cybersecurity program that really worked. So I hope to pass that on to you. As Samir says, ask us questions. Either you can even ask in this event, or you can contact either one of us afterwards. Even better, you can come and join one of the courses at HSG in terms of cybersecurity for leaders that you can build upon. But let's get started. Samir, go ahead and ask me
perfect.
a question.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. So the topic of the day is how to build up cyber resilient organizations. So we would like to get a little bit practical examples, practical strategic tactics and techniques from you. Therefore, first, we see that now the threat landscape is really increasing and increasing last 12 to 18 months. It is like extreme, especially during the AI age, right? The cyber attackers are using the AI tools because they have more resources, more flexibility, and more time, and to develop those tools and to attack the companies. And in this case, what are the key components to make up to resilient cybersecurity program? What are the key strategies that we have to look at first and start from there to make our company resilient against especially AI based cyber attacks?
Okay, good question. Let me start with you can't protect everything, right? So you got to do risk assessment. That your first starting point in any organization or corporation before you get into a program is to say, okay, what are the risks, the true risks to the enterprise? Um, my advice on this one, and companies that do get breached, maybe they haven't done the risk assessment up front, by the way, is to get a diverse team together, typically multifunctional, and in the context of Procter& and Gamble, global, because your threats as they may materialize in China or in Russia will be different to the US. So get together a diverse group of individuals and say, hey, what are the risks and what can we afford to let happen? What is our risk appetite, as it's called quite often? So once that's I would say the starting point, the foundation, right? As you look at those risks, look at not only the risks in terms of data loss, but risks in terms of disruption to your operations, obviously theft, and basically how you can get yourself, keep ensure you're not in the news for some significant risk that you never would want to see materialize. So that's really your starting point. And then the next step to create a mature program that is truly resilient. So to answer your question, Samir, here is have a strategy, right? If you run out and go and buy a stack of tools because you've been watching Formula One and you thought, there's CrowdStrike or Darktrace on the back of the Formula One cars. Yeah, large companies, I'll go and buy that tech stack, I'll be good. You're going to make a mistake, right? You will not get a return on the investment against buying those type of tools because you haven't put it into your company. You haven't prepared your company to put those tools into the work processes that are typically very unique to every single company. So the next step after risk assessment, before you buy the tech stack, is strategy, right? How am I going to embed a program that leverages tools, whatever I decide to select, into how my company operates or how the organization operates, right? That will then lead you into things like organizational design. If you look at companies that are breached, right, there would have been an indicator of compromise. There would be some flag in some tool that's gone up to say, hey, there's something that needs investigating there. Hopefully, it's been triaged and you get some perspective of where to go, right? But typically, what you want to do is have an organization that is prepared to act on the data, right? Companies that typically suffer a breach where it's propagated further than they wanted typically didn't have an organizational design model to respond to the indicators of either vulnerabilities or a deception platform or a threat analytics platform. It just didn't get action because they didn't see it or they couldn't contextualize how to use that information, that warning, that
Yes.
alert. So really, I think to answer your question, Samir, the starting point for resilient design has got to be basically the risk assessment, then the strategy and org design, right? And then you
Yes.
get into the fun part where most of us are technologists and we love buying stuff and we love going to cyber conferences and hearing about the latest tools. Well, now you can bring those tools into the context of your strategy and the risks that you want to protect against yourself, whether
Yes.
that's an organization that's regional or global.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Jeffrey. You just mentioned a risk to manage the risk, to make a catalog the risks and to identify the risks. Who are the responsible in the organization? Is the C-level management's responsibility? It is the responsibility of the CISO or a risk office or the lawyers, or is it collaborative work? Who should do
Yeah.
what to identify
Okay.
those risks? Because the risk can occur from the procurement, from the finance, or from IT
Yeah.
department as well.
Okay. So large corporations may have a risk manager that already has done some work on things like earthquakes or floods or hurricanes that, of course, Florida is going to see in the next few days, right? So you already will have an organization that typically assesses risk, right? My recommendation is, by the way, don't create a small IT organization that looks at risk in the context of IT, right? So to answer your question, the legal department will be interested now because you've got GDPR, California data
Yeah.
privacy, China data privacy. So where you're operating, you now need to have a legal understanding of the
Yeah.
obligations you have of operating in those various countries, those regions. So it's a combination of lots of individuals that come
Yeah.
together to define risk. So it can be legal purchases. You mentioned purchases, right? Of course, purchases have got to really get involved. You want them to manage the third party risk, right? I'll give you an example in P&G. In Procter& Gamble, we have 40,000 suppliers. 40,000, right? There is absolutely no way you can cover 40,000 suppliers with a third party risk management program. But you've identified a few that you say they're uber critical, they're providing an ingredient, or they're providing an IT service, or they're a financial service provider that has access to the crown jewels, to your high risk
Yes.
areas. Those are the the suppliers that you want to go after. But if you ask me who's accountable for risk, right? Who's going to lose their job? Who's going to get fired, right? Um, that's the board level. This when you do a risk assessment, you identify the risk appetite, you take it to the C-suite. This is what we
Yes.
did. We said, "Are you okay with this type of risk happening? I.e., this one, if it materializes, will take longer. This one will be faster and more responsive because we're going to make more investment in that area." So you blend where you want to make the investment against the risk, and then the board agrees to that risk. So that as and when it does materialize, and unfortunately these things do happen, they're part of the process of understanding the risk they accepted, and equally they provide the budget. Right?
Yes.
They come back to you and say, you may want to spend a couple of million, right, on certain programs, and they'll be comfortable that they've made an investment against a risk that they've agreed to. And I think this also puts the CISO or the global vice president of cybersecurity in a more I wouldn't say comfortable position, but you're in a position where you don't feel alone, right? When something
Yes.
happens, and the accountability is spread across the organization. So answer your question, and hopefully, Samir, I've done that, right? It's like it's your C-suite that ultimately should be
Mm-hmm.
responsible for the risk appetite. The execution of that, to put the
Yes.
provision of the resiliency rests with obviously the broader organization where you've delegated it. I could expand on this and say actually you you should move roles and responsibilities across your organization so that everybody in part feels accountable for the execution. But ultimately, it's the senior leadership that need to accept the risk against the investment that they've agreed to put in place.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Geoffrey. And cybersecurity is all about to protect mission critical assets that we have applications, data, networks, softwares, endpoints, perimeters, end of the day, human life and our business, right? And therefore, we have this certain rules, legal requirements, standards. And we have also limited people, resources that it's a big part or big risk for the organizations. In the same time, we see that organizations are really investing a lot of software, so technology. And we see a lot of new providers, vendors are in the market just uh, knocking the doors and trying to sell their products, right? And that's clear for everyone. And companies somehow they buy the products, and still they are hacked. What's the reason that they have huge technologies? They have a lot of software inside against the cyber threats, but they are still hacked. What's the
Yeah.
problem here?
I think the problem goes back to have you designed the organization, right? You may have the organization to respond to something when it happens, right? It's an indicator of compromise or some other alert comes up. The security operations center, which either you've insourced or outsourced, there's different sort of methodologies to this. Within Procter& Gamble, we insourced it. The reason was that we wanted to include our operating technology domain, so the industrial control systems in plants, into our security operations center. And that's not typically a service that's provided externally. You're very rarely will you find a security operations service that has an IT and OT operating knowledge, right? And secondly, your operating technologies, your manufacturing processes, your thousands of computers with these
Yes.
Microsoft operating systems, right? That are not easy to detect. They're sitting on very outdated, very diverse OT networks. Yeah, if you haven't considered that, right? In the OT domain and equally in some of your operations, your IT networks and asset management name may not be as mature as it should be. Which model is going to be the fastest to detect, respond, and action some remediation against the threat or the vulnerability that's being detected? Companies, going back to your question, companies that have been breached, they haven't necessarily thought through that scenario or what happens when the tools or the service provider says, yeah, Houston, we have a problem. Yeah, we need to go and take action somewhere. And usually those companies, that get breached, they were scrambling to find the assets. You mentioned applications as well, right? So it may be a vulnerability
Yes.
across a number of servers, a number of devices, right? Or it could be something that was down to a physical device's operating system where you need to apply a patch or take another action. If a company is scrambling to take action against these indicators, the longer you take, the worse the situations, particularly if you have an advanced persistent threat, so if you have a nation state issue, because the longer they're there, the longer they're going to necessarily start, covering their tracks, covering a
Mm-hmm.
lateral
Yes.
expansion, and then you're chasing a scenario that's racing away from you. So speed is of the essence, but speed typically comes with knowledge of your infrastructure, your IT and your OT, your applications, your hardware, where it resides. I think it goes also back, Samir, to the idea of strategy and organizational design. I'll give you an example. If something's happening in a P&G plant, we have 116 plants around the world, right? We have in each plant a site cybersecurity leader. who's been trained and certified. They have basic, fundamental, and advanced training, an internal training program. I haven't trained them on all of the details on how on security operations, but I've channeled the training to likely things I'm going to need to call you about. And when I
Mhm.
call you, you need to know where to go. And typically that individual, and there's also another individual because people take vacation, right? People are ill,
Yes.
they're not there 24/7. So you need to find at least two people in a site that understands the IT and the OT domain in that site. And those individuals you contact and you say, hey, we've got an indicator, right? We need this to be investigated. You with this local toolkits, and you can look at your network tools and otherwise. We triangulate them down to where they need to go to take the respective action. So I think answering your question, you may have a tech stack, right? You may have bought the CrowdStrikes and the dark traces after watching Formula One, right? But bringing that into play is hugely important in terms of how you design an organization and how you train internally to leverage the knowledge of your organization complemented with the tools that you're putting in place. This is why, as I said earlier, it takes time. It takes
Yes.
time to sort of,
Yes.
to develop that maturity of an organization, right? That then you can then have some measurable progress in the coming years.
Jeffrey, you are based in Geneva, but I see that you travel a lot. You join the different conferences, different events, and you hear a lot. And
Mm-hmm.
from your perspective, the last 2 or 3 years, especially after the pandemic, is there any specific sectors or industries that are more vulnerable to the new types of cyber attacks?
Well,
And
I think yeah.
what are they and why they are more vulnerable?
Well, I think the concern that I have, if you say it's not obviously lake related to COVID, obviously a number of organizations had to suddenly go into remote access. So
Mhm.
it's definitely, your access managing and into your environment from home networks and what have you, that needed some work. I think a lot of companies actually took that on board. Um, I think if I was to answer your question in terms of what keeps Jeff awake at night,
Yes.
what was the sort of stuff that I go? There's a risk there. It's the OT domain. If you talk to anybody who covers industrial cybersecurity now, so and remember, industrial cybersecurity is the IT sitting in manufacturing plants. You have an ICS firewall, industrial control system firewall, and below that, your OT domain. Yeah, and it's literally you have like times 100 number of microprocessors in your OT domain versus your IT domain. And I would challenge, and I wouldn't ask anybody to do it on this call, but if you were to pick up a scanning device, let's say a pineapple, right? And you go and park in a car park outside a manufacturing plant, and you turn that device on and you scan to see what's available in the vicinity, right? You will most likely be able to pick up an off-the-shelf microprocessor-based camera system, right? That has been bought by a well-intentioned engineer or technician, has been put on a production line. They haven't hardened it. They haven't disabled Wi-Fi, right? Bluetooth. They haven't changed the default password that came with that device, by the way, which you can then go to, various websites and find the default passwords that come with devices. And that is your inroad into an enterprise, into an organization, right? Because you can take control of the device. The device will be actually communicating to higher levels in the in the structure of the site, and then you can start a south to north migration from the trust zone into the untrust zone of the IT, right? And then you'll work your way through looking at traffic. You'll be able to pick up by various decryption techniques, passwords, and then start to propagate up. If you do not have in that domain any detection devices or vulnerability scanning, the first you'll see is when you come into the IT domain where you typically have invested in more technologies, right? So that was my number
Yes.
one concern. If you say like, Jeff, you still look very tired, well, that's why, because I've had many sleepless nights looking at the OT domain and saying, hey, what are we going to do there? Here's a watch out though. Free bit of sort of advice here for this team is like Don't plug IT solutions directly into the
Wow.
OT domain. Right? Good luck, because if you scan, for example, do a vulnerability scan in an OT network, you'll most likely knock out a number of very dated old microprocessors that you have in that domain. Because typically OT equipment, you can have a lifetime of equipment that's 25 years. So if you can have Windows XPs and what have you sitting in that environment, and if you start using traditional scanning, vulnerability scanning technology that hasn't been appropriately configured, you will knock out those CPUs, which are typically time critical. So not only is that the concern, Samir, right, in terms of where to look, it's also be very careful about how you address that concern with the technical stack. I always recommend to run things through a cyber lab. So we have a cyber lab that is representative of our old and new industrial control system technologies. And we're using that just to see if a tool, when it's applied in that area, is
Yes.
compatible with Siemens, Rockwell, or what have you. So I think those are the two things that have kept me sort of more concerned.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
Great. Thanks a lot. My another question is about total organization. Should organizations or corporation engage the total organization? What are the best practices to achieve this? Would you like to explain it more in deep a little bit? What does it mean, total organization? Because it's a kind of new term also for our audience
Yeah.
here.
Okay. Typically, your cybersecurity program is seen as an on cost to the organization. It's seen as a cost to run the business. I always say you're not going to get many Christmas cards, right? Because people are not going to love you because you're an on cost to the various operating budgets of the business units around the company. So you're going to have a finite amount of money, right? So you got to be clever here in terms of how you engage the whole organization to be part of that program. So it becomes how they do part of their work, right? So, for example, I'll go back to the engineering example. Um, Procter and Gamble spends $4 billion a year on capital equipment. $4 billion is spent building plants. Something that I did for my first 25, 28 years actually with the company was spend that money per year building new plants. As you
Yes.
build in new plants and what have you, and but we got about 3,000 engineers, right? Engage people like the engineers in your program. And how you do that is you basically say, when you go and request money out of an appropriation, you include an element in there typically for safety. So you're building some new plant, new chemical operation. There'll be a safety component. There'll be a training component to build up that new technology, bring it operational. Add a slice called cybersecurity in that appropriation process. Okay. So that, for example, if you're in Procter and Gamble now and you're an engineer and you're building a new plant, their expectation is that you will have an OT network designed around that, and you will have a vulnerability scanning and threat analytics platform within that appropriation request. And that's part of the check that we have to say, put that in place. And it's now part of the ecosystem, part of your work processes of how you fund and build it into the infrastructure of the organization. I was lucky. I was a capital systems manager for the company. So I was able to go into the standard, change the standard. And then now by default, we include cybersecurity and appropriation processes.
Yeah.
Another way to engage an organization, and I think you're going to cover that in a subsequent human factor related webinar, but make it visible, right? So bring to your organization posters when you walk into a plant and there's a plasma screen up there that you sit down and you learn around the safety practices. Don't get run over by a forklift truck, for example, right? Look, be safety aware as you come into the plant. We put a video up there that was and these are the cybersecurity expectations as you enter the site as an employee or as a visitor. So Samir, like you mentioned about the purchasing side, if you've got a service provider that's coming into the plant, that service provider is going to see that and they're going to know they cannot plug in their USB stick or device into our networks. They got to talk to the site cybersecurity leader before they do that. So I think there's numerous ways to embed within your organization awareness, right? And action, governance, funding processes to put in place a very robust program. You probably remember from one of my last lectures with your organization, I talked about using security operations data, right? A huge miss is the value of the data at your security operations center that you can bring to an organization. So I used to go to a site and I would look at the security operations data of what's been happening at that manufacturing site or in that headquarters or that technical office. And I'd say, these are the things we've blocked. these are the type of malware that we've seen. This is the type of unusual access management issues that we've detected and that we've investigated or blocked. Right? This is the status of the patching of your Windows operating systems in your location. Right? If you bring data to an organization to say, hey, look, these threats are real, right? Your
Yes.
general organization would typically say, oh, I didn't know, right? It shows them there is a system in place to detect it, but it equally tells them that there is a responsibility on their side to reduce the amount. Because I also, by the way, I gave them a stack of this is where you are and this is where everybody else is. So if you've got a site leader, a senior director sitting there, and I'm telling them, you're the worst, you're in the lower quartile of cybersecurity events, right, versus other sites. You may be the safest site in the world. You may be the site that's operating on a very efficient cost structure, but your cybersecurity is not benchmarked versus other organizations. And that also puts your site at risk because if you do get an event, that will be more dramatic in terms of your impact on your operations. So I think to answer your question on engaging an organization, right? It's bring the whole organization in through various tactics and means from awareness through data to training up cybersecurity specialists who can quickly respond to an event, to appropriation and investments where you put it into the system that is automatically going to be funding itself. And you're not having to go up to an IT president and ask for budget because actually the ecosystem itself is funding the continuation of the maturity of your program.
Yes. Obviously, the Procter and Gamble is a big organization. They have a budget. When we look at the SMEs, small and medium businesses, they don't have that much resources. They don't have that much knowledge, know-how. If you talk to the management or the owner of the SMB, what would be your first three go-to steps that you can say 1, 2, 3 that you need to start from these points to secure your business, to secure your data network, whatever you have as a mission critical assets?
Okay. It's a question I've had asked a number of times. Hey, Jeff, you live in a perfect world. Everybody else doesn't have the deep pockets. Believe you me, I sometimes wish I was in a small, medium enterprise because it's easier to manage the change in a smaller enterprise than a larger, right? But the process is still the same. Understand your risk, understand what are the work processes and org design that you have today that you can leverage, or that you may need to modify. If you're familiar with the Galbraith model on organizational design, you might want to refine your organization to better leverage the people you've got versus having to spend additional resources and people coming in. I think once you've gone through that, if you ask Jeff's opinion, it's patch management. I'm obsessive on patch management, right? So monthly patches on OT and IT systems got to be at like 95% month on month. There's always the 5% you've got to chase later because of a project or what's happening with that specific device. But a very rigorous patch management program. Then your access management into your organization. So how do you work with your Active Directory and you separate access controls? If you're really clever, you take the data in your organization and that's business critical and you divide it into component parts. I'll give you an example. In my last engineering role, I was covering Tide pods. So if any of you are doing detergent at home, it's your aerial pods, the three liquids and a water-soluble capsule. Yeah, with this one, what we did was we broke the data up in access management into different storage domains, right? So that if we lost, and if this was protecting against intellectual property loss, we basically had different access managements for those different pods of data, that those different areas of data. So you can actually, without spending any money, putting in sophisticated cybersecurity tools, protect your intellectual property by just the design of where you store the data, right? So start looking at low cost approaches, good practices. Patch management, identity and access controls in your environment, and then vulnerability and threat. Unfortunately, both tend to come together. Put those tools in, but only where you have the highest risk. You don't need to put that into your complete environment. Some areas you can afford to wait for something to happen, and then you'll pick it up when there's a lateral expansion, right? But you know that you can
Yeah.
still isolate that area, go back to it later. So it's not about deep pockets, I think, which is
Yes.
the essence of your question, right? It's about getting the insights, and HSG does that in the courses that you're leading, right? It says, be smart where you make those investments, right? But
Yes.
before you make those investments, please don't get carried away with the wonderful marketing campaigns of these cybersecurity tool and service providers, right? Know what you want. If you're going to cook a meal, when you go to the supermarket, you have a list of ingredients and you go and then select the ingredients, right? So
Exactly.
don't go and buy something on without having a list of ingredients and a plan, right? And really the cybersecurity program is the same. And yeah, and that's generally the advice I've given to companies, to C-suites when they want to mature a program is to do that. Maybe a one leg on top of that, and maybe we can cover that again in more detail if you want to, is put in a maturity program, a measure, right? I'm an engineer. Engineers love measuring things. We love it, right? Because you're never going to design something without measuring it and dimensionalizing what you want it to do and performance criteria. But typically in cybersecurity, adopt an ISO 27001. You can look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, a whole number of frameworks out there where against your risk appetite, you can use these frameworks to assess your progress year on year. And very importantly for the board, you can take that framework where your maturity can be defined by an external party. Don't assess yourself. You always score yourself high, right?
Yeah.
Get it externally assessed. And then you go back to the board and say, you had that risk appetite. Well, this is where we are in maturity against protecting that risk that we agreed with you. We're going to be the critical risks. And then you can have a discussion around where there's still gaps and where you need to go. So having some form of mature cybersecurity measure, maturity measure, is very critical in terms of, and any company, by the way, whether it's small, medium enterprise or a larger corporation, they can all apply the tool in different ways. And it gives you a sense of direction against your strategy, a measure against your strategy.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Jeffrey. Just a reminder to our audience, please feel free to ask any question you might have in the chat because we are coming to the last 20 minutes of the event and I will be very happy to read those questions for Jeffrey in case you have anything to Jeffrey or to me. And another question about Jeffrey, you just mentioned patch management, is the access management, password management, etc. Those basic tools and the low hanging fruits, right? So within the management, the SMBs, they have to have even a small internal team to manage everything from internal, or they should go to external service providers, depend on their expertise.
Your choice. I mean, whether you use an external provider to put those capability in place, we did that. We went to external access management providers that we put in place. You can do that internally as well. You can use standard tools and manage that process yourself. Maybe my add on that again, a little bit of perspective from the P&G program is we kept the IT domain separate from the OT domain in terms of access management, right? Reason being is we just want to keep the two separate. It actually has played out in a number of companies that have kept those two separate, that if there is an incident happening in the IT domain, your OT domain carries on running because your access management and your controls and what have you remain there. And you can carry on running a manufacturing operation even if there's something that you need to address in the IT domain. You can choose whatever tool or methodology you want. I think again, it comes down to, you said earlier, around how to engage an organization. Well, human resources, people management. Typically, people change roles within 3 to 5 years in a company, sometimes a little bit quicker, or they go to different geographies. Your internal organization, right, is important because it's got to manage the people and their assignments. What do they need access to do for their specific role? And when they change the role, you then change the access rights and you rescind the previous access rights that they've had. So if in terms of managing the application of access controls, it is within the organization. You need to actually use the tools available for access into it. What we did was we gave ownership of applications and hardware to individuals. So basically, if we have an incident, we know who to call for a specific application, for example, or firmware. But if you're owning an application, maybe it's an infantry management tool, right, that accesses certain sites or whatever, right? There is a person in the company who is assigned to manage that application and who has access into that application. And they go for a regular governance cycle to make sure whoever has access rights into their application has been signed off by their senior leader, that they need that as part of their work role, their responsibility. So you may have some work process tools out there that defines role and responsibility in an organization, and therefore what access rights naturally go with that role and responsibility. That's an internal mechanism, right? The tool you use can be obviously external, but internal. And I wouldn't put it to one department to be
Yes.
responsible for access rights. Delegate responsibility of access control to the people at an asset level, whether that's an application, a server, a piece of hardware.
I remember last time in University of St. Gallen in June, you gave us to our audience very good practical examples to increase the cyber awareness, the culture of the organization-wide, from general users up to board levels. Would you like to share some of the best practice tactics that how to increase awareness, the culture in a small SME in Switzerland? What would be the best practice to keep the people's mind that this is the cyber, those are the risks, those are the best practices you have to do?
Yeah, I think it goes to numerous parts of the organization in terms of culture and awareness. Your C-suite, and you remember in St. Gallen, I ran a tabletop at the end of the day, right?
Yes.
We ran the tabletop I ran during the course was the same tabletop we ran with the chief executive officer and the C-suite of Procter and Gamble, and it took half a day, and it drove awareness at the C-suite level on a risk. And by the way, I took a really hot example of something we just launched, so that it wasn't something they couldn't relate to, right? They could actually say, "Oh gosh, yeah, that would have been significant." So at a board level, tabletops, right? And then you can do tabletops at different levels and at different locations within your organization. Doesn't matter about whether you're small, medium, or large enterprise, right? The value of a tabletop is hugely beneficial. It checks out the maturity of your organization as well. In terms of your other element of your question, which is awareness. Well, I mentioned earlier that if you walk into a site, you'll see a video screen that talks about this. And if you remember from the lecture, we have cartoon characters that we created. that was beyond language. It was characters walking around a screen doing things you shouldn't do and you should do. And we have a cybersecurity character that shows the threat and actually where that threat could materialize. And it's a visual communication. Um, Posters around sites, very useful. Please use the security operations data to make it personal, right? So that the site says, oh my goodness, we had, I don't know, 1,000 events over last month at these levels of severity that had to be addressed. It's very real. So people leave looking at a poster saying, my gosh, stuff is happening here. This is not something in a remote IT department and we don't need to worry about it. It brings it back to them to being personal. Um, Give people trainings in posters that they can take home to their families and kids. Because if you can give them something, the value that they can better protect their families, that again drives awareness and it's actually doing something good for the community we live in, right?
Yes.
And the last one, I think I'll leave with a bit of a smile on your face here with the example of the potty poster, if you remember. When
Yes.
you go to the when you go to a restroom or toilet, whatever you want to call it in P&G, you sit down. We'll have a cybersecurity poster in front of you that explains all the metrics, what's happening in that site. So I actually have your attention for a couple of minutes.
Mhm.
So if you can, put it out there that people can see that it's something they are responsible for, then you've won. Then you've been successful because you've developed a cybersecurity program, as I said earlier, that's risk-based, has a strategy, has a total organization, to your point on total organization, Samir, right? And you've got some measures in place, and then you've got the tech stack that obviously supports what you want to achieve.
Mhm. Thanks a lot, Jeffrey. Now we are starting to get some questions from auditorium. I would like to read the first question, even the time is running so fast. I have a lot of questions to you. The first question about third-party security risk management. If we decide to buy a software, there are hundreds of suppliers. What are the best practice to assess, elaborate the security risk level of the suppliers, third-party suppliers? Do we need a contract? Do we need a report, audit reports, logs? What we have to ask, even if the supplier is bigger than us, like Amazon, like I don't know, XYZ, the cloud providers.
Yeah, I mean, addressing third-party risk is a headache because you have a diversity of suppliers and typically a number of services, and more importantly, access management into your environment. So first and foremost, you've got to look at what risk does that third-party provider supply if they're integrated into your company's ecosystem, or they're
Mhm.
a critical supplier of a material, right? Yes, you can. I won't quote the companies, but we tested out a number of companies that could act on our behalf as third-party risk management assessors, right? I think that works. If you divide your organization up or your suppliers into those that you just want to check that they're cyber secure to a minimum level, the questions are pretty obvious. You can delegate that out. Then there are those suppliers, and it's a very, very thin slice, maybe 1%, where you shouldn't rely on a third party risk company who's typically going to ask questions. And most suppliers will say yes when maybe their system isn't that mature, right? Um, but I don't want that for the 1% that's uber critical for the company. In that case, the business unit or the individual that's leveraging the services or materials, they need to take a team to that site to visit that supplier and spend a day there and really ask questions and ask for evidence of something being put in place and done. You typically can't scan a supplier, even if they're connected into your network, right? There's legal boundaries of what you can and cannot do. You may, with those 1% suppliers, say, look, let's jointly leverage the company we use to come into your environment and to run a scan. Because maybe they're a very small supplier, right? Don't have limited capabilities, but they're of strategic importance to you. Then you make a partnership saying, look, we'll give you the connections, the capabilities to better scan and understand your environment. The outcome of that report will be specific to you. We don't want to be involved in it, but we at least give you the insight that maybe you didn't otherwise have, right? And then we can then get an assurance from you that you've reached some level of maturity on cybersecurity. That means we can trust you for either a supply or a service provision. It is a headache. I'm not going to say it isn't with third party, but you've got to assess the risk and then look to see, do you want to have, for say, 10% of the suppliers, a third party risk management program? And for that slice of 1%, be a little bit, I wouldn't say intrusive, but something along those lines with the suppliers that you can truly trust them.
Thanks a lot, Chef. I'm going to read another question since we have the less time. The SMEs often claim that they are too small and not important to hackers, malicious actors, right? Is that true? And how do these actors search for victims? It's all about the money, all about political or other
Okay.
ideological attacks.
Okay, read the Verizon and various other reports. You'll see the sort of nature of the type of attacks, whether they're malicious, financially, or simply nation state disruptive, right? I think for companies in terms of the risk to you, right, you as an organization, depends what you do. Um, I'll give you an example. The water-soluble film that encapsulates a Tide pod or an aerial pod, right? That comes from a very small company that we partnered with, right? That company is of no interest to nation state. Right? It's just simply providing us with a very unique material that we use, right? But we want that company to be secure, not because that they are a target for intellectual property theft, right? But they may be there, they may suffer from an inadvertent malicious software that goes out, right? So, WannaCry, not Petra, right? You may be receiving something that it was not intended for you, right? But it will knock you out. And if you go back to the WannaCry and not Petra, viruses and malware that came out previously, it wasn't because those companies were targeted. It just happened they were in that ecosystem of where that malware went, right? So don't be paranoid that you think you're the target, right? You might want to be
Yes.
paranoid that you may be the recipient of commodity malware that can infect your environment. That's why I talked about patching earlier. If you patch, you typically protect yourself against that commodity-based threats.
Mhm.
But if you're a small player, so I'll give you another example. If you're a small IT service company, or you're a small player company that's managing the services of a servo drive system that are in a couple of manufacturing plants around the world, you may be a target because you're the inroad into those larger corporations, right? So you've seen a
Yes.
number of attacks where small players are compromised as a bridge into the larger corporations, right? You've seen many of them over the news
Mhm.
of ways you can break into a corporation is not by the front door, is via the back door with a third party provider. So good practices are needed across the board against the commodity threats that sit out there, right? But also, and maybe a targeted attack on you
Yeah.
if you are providing something that could be materially of value with other companies that you work with, a bridge into those organizations.
Thanks a lot. I'm going to read the next question. External versus internal. Do we not have to differ between OT processes and instant crisis organization? And should we not consider the size and risk exposure that are relevant?
Okay, if I understand it correctly, right, it's like how do we assess how to action an OT versus an IT risk,
Yes.
internal or external, right? You can outsource more effectively IT. IT is pretty boring, if I put it that way, right? It's predictable, it's 5-year-old technologies. the type of threats and vulnerabilities that are there are typically in the domains like DB exploit and what have you. They're all pretty defined. In the OT domain, it's a different ballgame, totally different ballgame, because you have those dated operating systems that I described earlier, right? And you have to have knowledge of where those devices are in your environment and whether they're business critical or process critical. So, for example, if it's in a chemical plant, and we have chemical operations within the organization, we actually are a power generator. We actually generate electrical power in the US to feed our plants, right? Yeah, in those instances, you want to have, if there's something materializing in the OT domain, and you may have picked it off the network, or some vulnerability has been identified of a new device that's been plugged in, you really want to take action in a more measured way, right? And typically the protocol in a security operations center is defining where the asset resides. If it resides in the IT domain, you can typically action that remotely. It could be a device, a server. It's just going to have an impact on an IT operating system, right? But if it's in the OT domain, you typically will not, and I repeat it, will not go and isolate or shut down a device if you have an indicator of malware or something on that device that looks like it needs some investigation. You typically call the site, and you will call the site cybersecurity lead and say, this asset, MAC address, IP, any other data you have on what's on that device, you send that direction to a company person, an internal resource to go and examine it. You will typically not find that, let's call it OT forensics capability in an external organization. So, and in the OT domain, leverage your engineering organization, because the engineers that invariably have installed that infrastructure, installed the devices, can contextualize the risk, and then can go and take the action. So I think in answer to the question, you can outsource the IT domain if you believe that's appropriate, but the OT domain, look internal first and foremost, because you've really got to understand your industrial control systems first and foremost.
Thanks a lot. We have last two questions. I'm going to read them, and then in 5 minutes we will close the session. The first question is all about the communication challenges between the board and the team. What would you advise when the most risks that are brought to the board are accepted instead of mitigated? Because the board believes that it will not happen, but the technical team believes that it will be a big risk for the organizations. Is there a solution that doesn't imply waiting for an incident?
Okay. You don't really want to wait for an incident to prove that you were right. Generally not a good approach, right? I think the skill of a CISO, and I think we cover that in the cyber conference in Zurich that's coming up, right? The skill of a CISO is to communicate effectively risk and what needs to be done. They need to be able to bridge that tendency for a C-suite to say, is it really a risk? It seems very unlikely. The approach should be benchmark, right? Go and say, hey, look, this other company had a similar risk. They didn't invest in this area. It had this detrimental impact on that company. I use, it's unfortunate, but I do use it. Key competitor to Procter & Gamble, Reckitt and Benckiser, is a home care business that's competing with 1/6 of the business of P&G. And they had a cyber incident. This must have been about 15 years ago. So it was the WannaCry, not Petra. And they were down, and their manufacturing operations went down, and they lost. And then I took it with the board. It's on the internet. Yeah, they lost, but I think it's around $200 million worth of sales, right? Because they had not invested in that ability to patch effectively when when that malware hit their operations. So your discussions with the board to convince them should be based on not only the internally perceived risk, but the icing on the cake is if you can then compare it with peer companies and say, look, this is how that risk materialized in these other companies. Would you be okay to incur that same risk? And invariably, your leadership will say, we don't want that to happen to us. And we say, okay, and these are the investments and the good practices you need to put in place. So, yeah, it actually the role of a CISO or a global VP of cybersecurity is how to correlate meaningfully risk to the senior leaders, showing that you've thought through how to do it cost effectively, return on investment, right? Don't just be seen as a cost, be seen as something where you're risk based. You've tried to sort of minimize the cost to protect against the risk appetite you want them to agree to.
Yeah, thanks a lot. The last question is all about cloud, secure provider, and risk management. Many secure solutions are now cloud-based, and how significant do you consider that the risks on dependencies to such cloud service providers? Are we depend on them to manage our risks, or?
Yeah, I think the cloud service providers are there and they're going to grow, right? We actually are even connecting our analytics in the OT domain. We punch through the firewall and up to a cloud program to run the analytics. We're all leveraging AI, right? That computing power is typically best placed in the cloud, right? So I think it's inevitable we're going to use cloud, but you're using them to provide insight against the risk that you want. Because the question was, are you letting them manage your risk? No, they're providing data, vulnerability, threat, access management, alerting, which gets communicated down to your organization. You then look at it and correlate it to the risk that you believe your enterprise should manage, and then you take action. See the cloud providers not as managing your risk, but see the cloud providers providing insights, data, alerts against which you can manage your risks. Just see a little differently than managing risk. I don't, yeah, I don't want to delegate risk management outside of the enterprise. The enterprise is responsible for its own risk. And that's what the shareholders and stakeholders will always say. Right? The risk is borne by the company. It's not borne by a third party. They just provide supporting data infrastructure.
Yeah, great, great. Thanks a lot, Jeffrey. I believe that was a very informative session and a very productive discussion as well. We had good questions over here from auditorium. First webinar of the month, and from my perspective, it was successful because your know-how, knowledge that you shared with our audience, hands-on knowledge that's not theoretical but hands-on, practical, applicable. And therefore, I would like to thank you for your time and for your energy and knowledge, know-how. Looking forward to have you again at the University of St. Gallen at our CAS Cybersecurity for Leaders program as a lecturer, and looking forward to welcome you also at the conference this year in November. And thanks a lot to everyone, to our audience, the attendees. It was a 60-minute session with you, and looking forward to have you on the following webinars again, to see you there. Have a nice afternoon and stay safe.
Okay,
Bye,
thanks
Jeffrey.
again.